Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for yet another episode of Let's Talk. Now, today we're going on to Ephesians chapter 6, and we're looking at Paul's counsel to children and parents, masters and slaves. Now, for today, I'm not going to talk about children and parents. I'm going to talk about masters and slaves. Now, that context, masters and slaves, just the topic of slavery alone, would bring in different thoughts, would bring in different fears, attitudes towards that topic. Why? Because it's like, okay, there's slavery and we're okay with it. I think that's the first thing that comes to your mind, depending on which side of the table you're sitting. So there's slavery. And we don't talk about it being bad or what. We talk about it as if it's a societal norm. It's normal in our society, and that's fine. So you're bound to have different views pertaining to that. Now, while discussing with my friends and all, some say, it was a context. There was the time. It was acceptable. Legally, it was acceptable. Society accepted it, and that there was nothing that Paul could do than to allow the situation to continue peacefully in a Christian way, as it was. Maybe if I say slavery, it might seem very far. Let's talk about apartheid. In South Africa, a system that is segregatory. That system. And then we say, okay, what the pastor is supposed to do is to just make sure that the people are faithful Christians in that environment. Definitely, we will differ on how to handle that. That's what I'm saying. But today, I'm going to drive lessons all the same from those situations. I'm going to drive lessons from Paul himself. I'm going to drive lessons from the masters and the slaves. Now, some also say, or some feel that you can't exactly say or go and say and not agree with Paul in terms of his attitude towards slavery or his position towards slavery. I would say, this issue of slavery and the issue of polygamy in the Bible, more or less the same. You've got many verses, contexts, and situations where you have patriarchs that have more than one wife and also have concubines, and they are still God's best friends. And you've got situations where God addresses David and says, David, if you had asked for more wives, I would have given you more wives, but you chose to take this one and kill the husband. I'm not happy with that. So does that mean I have to go and say, and pray for more wives? I think not. What is my point? My point is, yes, there are some descriptive things in the Bible which describe things as they happened then. We derive lessons from them, but it doesn't mean that we have to say, accept them as they are, and say, because there is polygamy, therefore I can also be polygamous. Because there is a master-slave relationship, therefore I should also have a master-slave relationship. No, it doesn't go like that. You also have a situation where Paul and Peter, they clearly don't agree on a certain matter. This was an evangelistic thrust. They don't agree. And I don't know. And so it's not unholy or unchristian to say, okay, I this position is not really clear for me. I'll leave it between you and God to understand it the way you understand it. So for me, Paul and God addressed this slavery issue in Ephesians. I think they best understand the context in their context. They best know what was going on in that situation. That's why inspiration put it like that, with that advice to say, go and work with fear and trembling for your master, as if you're working for the Lord. They understand it in their context. I don't understand it in their context. I don't understand in their context. I won't try to understand in their context. But still, I'll derive lessons from them. I think that is what is important. Now, I think Paul was more on the side of the master. Paul seems to be on the side of the masters and not on the slaves. Now, I understand him and where he's coming from and what he's doing. I mean, Paul gives 4 verses for the slaves and just 1 verse for the masters. He goes into detail and trying to explain how the slave is supposed to be a faithful slave. And for the masters, it's more of like, to me, it's more of like a by the way, so that people don't say, I didn't say anything about the masters. It says, masters, you should also be masters, knowing that you've got a master in heaven. And that's one verse, and then it's finished. 4-1. So to me, it was like he was already beating the slaves who were already down, and he was already, adding insult to injury, if you would ask me. Now, but I understand him. You need to understand, to know Paul, to understand where he's coming from, right? Now, why do I say that? First of all, Paul is a Jew, a Roman citizen of the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day. Regarding the law, he was a Pharisee, a lawyer by profession. Education-wise, he was taught by the best, that is Dr. Gamaliel, a doctor of law. He sat at his feet and he was taught. So Paul went to a private school. He was a Pharisee, is an elite group in society. So Paul is from a very up-class society. So he's more likely to be friends with masters than with slaves. He's most likely to have learnt with masters than with slaves. He has most likely had interactions with masters. He actually probably knows them by name than the slaves. So I understand him when he takes, so to speak, a softer stance on the masters and a harder stance on the slaves. I understand him. And it happens in life. With the people that you are with, you are most likely to be softer, to be friendlier, because they are humans. So it's understandable. The other point that I say I understand Paul is because he was an evangelist or a pastor, or someone who was establishing churches. And he had an interest in making sure that the churches grow, an interest that the gospel doesn't die or doesn't suffer because of petty things, not petty, in terms of social things. So his priority was the gospel. Let's have the gospel going. Let's set up a church and have the gospel going. That was Paul's priority. And you know where the church is worshipped? The church is worshipped in homes. And you know who the owners were? The masters. So if you read the book of Philemon, a letter about a slave, you discover that Paul says, and greet the church that worships at your home. He's talking to a master of a slave. So Paul was in a catch-22 situation. Now, how do you handle this issue when the person who owns the church is the master and is the one who is exploitative and abusing slaves? You see, how do you handle that situation? So I understand where Paul is coming from. I understand his situation. But nonetheless, we'll derive lessons from them. What lessons do I learn from Paul? Now, the first lesson I learned from Paul is we need wisdom when handling these issues. We need God's wisdom to guide us and help us to manage these power dynamics that we find ourselves in whilst we're at church. There are various power dynamics that are there. Some have intellectual power, some have financial power, some have influential power. So as a leader who's leading a church, I think your primary gospel being evangelistic in nature, we should pray for wisdom and find ways to maintain equality in the church. But I would also want to quote some quotations and instructions and verses and statements that us as leaders usually give members when they go through challenges of similar nature, but maybe at work, when they have situations where their beliefs are contradicting a situation that they are in. Like in this situation, let's assume Paul knew that slavery was wrong. Let's assume that Paul understood that slavery was wrong, but nonetheless he felt he should just deal with the slaves and just have one verse for the masters. If that is the case, the advice that we usually give people is, have faith. That's what we tell people. Have faith, pray about it. Stand on the truth, like the three Hebrew boys. Leave consequences to God. Don't worry about consequences. God will take care of you. That's the advice we'd give people. We'll say, sometimes we say that God will take off his church. Don't do, just be faithful and be strong. This is the advice that we give. And if I was going to give, if we were going to give the polls of this day and say do that, they will discover that it's very difficult to apply some of these quotations. Now, one of the quotations is that you hear flying around when you have a challenge that bids on your faith and your situation at work or at school. They will say the greatest one of this world is for men who cannot be bought or sold, men who are true to duty as the needle is the pole, men who call sin by his right name. If we are to use that attitude in Paul's situation, I don't know what results we'd get. Why am I saying this? Because as leaders, when we're now going to give advice to people that are in difficult situations, let us try and be empathetic. Let us not just be full of verses and quotations, but let us understand the different pieces of the puzzle that your member is trying to piece together. Let us not just shoot people. They say, at work, they're asking me to do this. Then you just say, don't do it, stop, don't do it. I don't think that is the wise way of handling it. Because if that was the wise way, then Paul was supposed to tell the masters of the slave that, masters, stop being abusive. Stop being this. Stop doing that. Stop doing that. He would have been elaborative about master's behavior the same way he was elaborative about the slaves' behaviors. But my point is, let us be wise in giving counsel. That is what I learned from. Now, the second lesson that I derive from the masters. Now we move to the masters. The lessons that I learned from the masters. Now, you are a master. Don't think of a master somewhere else. You also are a master. In terms of, even if you look at where you worship, you're a master. You've got people that are below you in terms of power dynamics. You're more powerful than other people. So Paul is talking to you as well. And also I'm also referring to you as a master, even in your home, at church, in your community, at your workplace. You're a master. Now, from a church context, masters, let us be humble enough to be able to be rebuked. Let us allow ourselves to be taught, to be rebuked. Let us not build walls. Let us not build situations that make it difficult for us to be rebuked. As well, let us show the difference of having a master in the world, or a heathen master and a Christian master. Let us take advantage and show that having a Christian master is beneficial. A Christian master understands God. A Christian master follows God's bidding. Christian masters are not supposed to just follow what society does, even if it's sanctioned by the law. I'm talking about slavery here. Slavery was acceptable in society, and even the law supported slavery. Does it mean a Christian master should do it? Definitely not. Christian masters should be able to show that here there is light. Do you remember in the Old Testament, in Egypt, when Moses, the 10 plagues, people could see that in the camp of Israel, there was light, when everywhere else there was darkness. The other lesson that I learned, actually, talking about masters. So Paul failed to rebuke a master and in the same place save a slave, so to speak. I realized that it's very difficult for someone who wasn't a slave to redeem another slave. What am I saying? It would take a slave to redeem a slave in most cases. It takes someone who has been abused to help someone who has been abused as well, in most cases. It is more of like someone who's been widowed or someone who's been bereaved. It is that person who has gone through that hurt, who is able to help and redeem and to help someone in similar situations. The best person to rescue the Israelites out of Egypt was Moses. Why? Because he was a slave. His parents were slaves. He was born in slavery. He went to the palace, and for the formative years of his life, his mother was his nurse. And when his mother was his nurse, imagine your mother coming to the palace and going back to the compound. Coming to the palace, going back to the compound. Definitely, you will not be fine. You will not be fine. So he took Moses, a slave, to go and redeem other slaves. So it is with our Savior. Christ had to be born a slave, born into a poor family, born into a blended family, not so best family, step brother that. And on top of that, his elder father then passes away whilst he was still young. So he grows up in this family and he dies a death on the cross, the worst type of death. It only takes such a person to redeem other people likewise. So that's what I learned. So the gifts, or the experiences rather, that you have gone through in life, we're supposed to use them to redeem other people. The scars that we have had in our lives should be able to minister to other people and help them to pass through the Red Sea that they're going through. Now, finally, let me talk about slaves and then conclude the lesson. For slaves, I would want to say that slaves need to continue praying. That's a cliche. But the truth be told, slaves need to continue praying, need to continue to have hope whilst in that situation, for starters. Secondly, slaves need to find a way to get out of slavery. If you are in a situation where you're a slave, there is need for you to look for ways to get out of slavery. It is not God's ideal or neat decision, or it's not God's will that is people live lives enslaved. I'm not going to categorize which type of slavery. You need to assess your situation and see and ask yourself, am I in slavery? Am I a slave? But you need to look for ways. You need to also pray for wisdom, that God helps you to make wise decisions pertaining to how you will handle your situation. If you're going to stay, how you will handle that. If you're going to run like Onismo, how you're going to handle that. I pray that the Lord helps us. At the end of the day, it is our prayer that together the evangelist Paul and the master and the slave will accept Christ and see him when he comes for the second time. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of his word. Amen.